My father made me promise that I would never sell his old pocket watch. For 32 years, I kept that promise without question. Until one rainy afternoon, a stranger knocked on my door, looked directly at that watch, and said something that changed everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. There are promises we make because we understand them, and there are promises we keep simply because they were asked by someone we loved. Mine belonged to the second kind. For more than 3 decades, an old pocket watch remained inside the top drawer of a small oak cabinet in my living room. It wasn't made of gold. It wasn't covered with diamonds. It didn't even work anymore. Its hands had been frozen at 417 for as long as I could remember. Anyone else would have called it worthless. But my father never allowed anyone to treat it that way. The first time he placed it in my hands, I was only 16 years old. He closed my fingers around the cold brass case and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not fear. Not sadness. Something much deeper. Almost like regret. If anything ever happens to me, he stopped, looked toward the kitchen where my mother was humming while preparing dinner. Then he lowered his voice. Never sell this watch. I laughed. It seemed like such an odd request. Dad, who would even want this old thing? His face never changed. You have to promise. I smiled. I promise. He squeezed my shoulder. No matter how difficult life becomes. I nodded again. I won't sell it. He looked relieved, as if a burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. At the time, I thought he was simply sentimental. My father had always been that way. He repaired old furniture instead of buying new. He kept every birthday card I had ever written. He still carried the same leather wallet he'd owned since before I was born. Keeping old things wasn't unusual for him. So I never questioned the watch. Years passed. Life happened the way life always does. I married, moved away, had children, lost my mother. Then, one cold November morning, I lost my father too. At the funeral, dozens of people came to pay their respects. Neighbors, former co-workers, old friends, people whose names I barely recognized. Everyone described him the same way. Kind, honest, quiet, reliable. A man who never expected recognition. As we cleaned out his house afterward, my younger brother found the pocket watch inside his nightstand. He held it up and laughed. This thing. He shook it gently. It doesn't even tick anymore. One of my cousins smiled. You could probably get $20 from an antique shop. Without thinking, I reached over and took it from his hands. No. Everyone looked at me. I'm keeping it. Nobody argued. They assumed it held sentimental value. Only I knew the truth. It wasn't sentiment. It was a promise. So, I placed it in my purse, took it home, and slid it into the top drawer of my cabinet, where it stayed for 32 years. Sometimes I'd take it out, brush away the dust, win the crown even though it never moved. Wonder why 417 mattered. Wonder why my father had been so serious. Wonder what he had never told me. Eventually, I stopped asking. Some mysteries simply become part of the furniture of our lives. You stop expecting answers. You learn to live beside the silence. Until one ordinary afternoon, the silence finally answered back. It was raining. The kind of slow autumn rain that makes the whole neighborhood look sleepy. I was making tea. My granddaughter had visited that morning, leaving cookie crumbs all over the kitchen table. The television played quietly in the background. Nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. Then, someone knocked on my front door. Not once. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate. Patient. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door. Standing there was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s. He wore a dark wool coat soaked from the rain, a flat cap, leather gloves. His eyes looked tired, but strangely familiar. Not because I knew him, because they carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime searching. He smiled politely. I'm sorry to disturb you. His voice was calm. I'm looking for someone. I assumed he had the wrong address. I think you've mistaken the house. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an old photograph, black and white, edges worn smooth by time. There used to be a man who lived here years ago. I looked down. The moment I saw the photograph, my heart stopped. It was my father, much younger, standing beside another man. The stranger slowly lifted his eyes toward me. I've been trying to find his family for almost 40 years. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the stranger's cap and fell onto my front step. Behind him, the street was nearly empty, blurred beneath the gray afternoon sky. But I barely noticed any of it. My eyes remained fixed on the photograph in his hand. My father could not have been more than 25 years old. His hair was dark then, combed neatly to one side. He wore rolled-up sleeves and suspenders, and there was a faint smile on his face. It was not the careful smile he used in family photographs. It was open, young, almost carefree. The other man stood beside him with one hand resting on my father's shoulder. He was taller and thinner, with a narrow face and a crooked grin. Behind them stood an old railway building. A painted sign hung above the door, but most of the words had faded. I leaned closer. "Where did you get this?" The stranger looked down at the photograph as though it had become too heavy to hold. "My brother kept it." "Your brother?" "Yes." He paused. His name was Daniel Mercer. The name meant nothing to me. I searched my memory for any mention of a Daniel. My father had spoken about co-workers from the factory, neighbors from his childhood, and a few men he had known during the war years. But I had never heard that name. "I'm sorry," I said. "My father never mentioned him." The stranger gave a tired nod. I was afraid of that. Something in the way he said it made me uneasy. Not disappointed. Not surprised. Almost as if my father's silence had confirmed something he had suspected for years. I looked past him toward the rain. "Would you like to come inside?" He hesitated. "I don't want to impose. You came a long way. Nearly 600 miles. That answer settled it. I stepped aside. "Come in." He removed his cap as he entered. His hair was silver and thin, flattened by the rain. He wiped his shoes carefully on the mat, then stood in the hallway without moving, taking in the framed photographs on the wall. There was one of my parents on their wedding day, one of my father holding me as a baby, another of him sitting beside my two children beneath the apple tree in our old backyard. The stranger stared at that photograph longest. "He grew old," he whispered. The words carried such sadness that I felt suddenly protective. "Of course he did." The man glanced at me, realizing how strange his comment sounded. "I'm sorry. I only knew him when he was young." "Knew him how?" He folded his gloves and placed them inside his coat pocket. "My name is Samuel Mercer." He offered his hand. I shook it. "Eleanor Hayes." "I know." That made me pull my hand away. Samuel noticed. "Your name was written on the back of another photograph." He reached into his coat again and removed a small envelope. The paper was yellowed and soft at the edges. He did not open it. Instead, he held it carefully between both hands. "My brother died last winter." "I'm sorry." He was 86. He had been ill for some time. Samuel looked toward the living room. "Before he died, he asked me to find your father. My father has been gone for 32 years. I learned that 3 months ago." He lowered his eyes. "I wish I had found him sooner." I led Samuel into the living room. He sat on the edge of the sofa while I went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of tea. My hands were trembling slightly. I told myself it was because of the cold air from the open door. But that was not true. There was something about Samuel's presence that made the room feel different, as though the past had entered with him and was now sitting patiently on my sofa. When I returned, he was looking at the oak cabinet. The top drawer was closed. The watch remained inside. He could not possibly know that. Yet his eyes lingered there. I placed the tea in front of him. "You said your brother knew my father." Samuel wrapped both hands around the cup, but did not drink. "They worked together for a short time." "At the railway?" "Yes." "The old Easton freight station." I had heard my father mention Easton once or twice. He had worked there before meeting my mother. But he never spoke about those years in detail. What happened between them? Samuel exhaled slowly. "That is difficult to explain." "Try." He looked at me. Your father saved my brother's life. I sat back. My father never told us anything like that. I'm not surprised. Why? Because what happened that night wasn't something either of them wanted remembered. The clock above the fireplace ticked steadily. Samuel's words seemed to remain in the room after he spoke them. What night? October 17th, 1951. The date stirred nothing in me, but Samuel remembered every detail. There was a freight accident outside Easton. 3 rail cars broke loose during a storm. One of them was carrying industrial chemicals. I stared at him. My father was involved in an accident. He was there. Was anyone killed? Samuel's face tightened. Yes. How many? 4 officially. The word officially caught my attention. What does that mean? It means the report didn't tell the whole story. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Samuel finally lifted the tea to his lips, though I noticed he barely drank. I looked once more at the photograph. My father, Daniel Mercer. 2 young men smiling in front of a railway station. Whatever had happened between them, nothing in their faces hinted at tragedy. You said my father saved Daniel. He did. How? Samuel looked at the top drawer again. This time I was certain. His eyes had gone directly to it. He placed the cup on the table. Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor. Eleanor. He swallowed. Did your father leave you an old pocket watch? The question struck me so sharply that I stood without realizing it. Samuel's expression changed. Not triumph, not greed, recognition. You have it, he said. I did not answer. He leaned forward. Please understand. I'm not here to take it. How do you know about the watch? My brother spoke about it for 60 years. I felt the blood drain from my face. What did he say? Samuel reached for the yellowed envelope. He said the watch belonged to a dead man. The room became completely still. I looked toward the cabinet. For 32 years, I had believed the watch belonged to my father. He carried it, protected it, made me promise never to sell it. But now a stranger had traveled 600 miles to tell me otherwise. Samuel placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. He also said your father spent the rest of his life waiting for someone to come looking for it. I stared at him. Who? Samuel's eyes filled with something close to pity. The family of the man who died at 417. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound in the room came from the rain tapping softly against the windows. My eyes drifted toward the oak cabinet, the top drawer, the watch. For 32 years, it had been nothing more than an old promise. Now it felt like evidence. I slowly stood. I'll be right back. Samuel gave a small nod but said nothing. As I crossed the living room, memories surfaced one after another. My father polishing the brass case with an old cotton cloth. My father winding the crown every Sunday evening, even though the hands never moved. My father staring silently at it while sitting alone on the porch after dinner. At the time, I thought he simply missed his younger years. Now, I wasn't so sure. I opened the drawer. The watch lay exactly where I had left it 6 months earlier. A faded blue handkerchief was folded beneath it. I picked it up carefully. The brass had darkened over the years. Tiny scratches covered the case. The chain felt heavier than I remembered. I carried it back to the coffee table. Samuel's eyes widened the moment he saw it. He didn't reach for it. He simply stared. I never thought I'd see it again. I placed it gently on the table between us. You said it belonged to another man. Samuel nodded. So my father stole it? No. The answer came immediately. Almost offended. Your father wasn't that kind of man. Then why did he keep it? Samuel looked at the watch for several seconds before answering. Because someone asked him to. Those words sent a chill through me. Who? Samuel pointed to the frozen hands. His name was Thomas Whitaker. The name meant nothing. He was 28 years old. Samuel spoke slowly now, as though each memory had to be lifted carefully from somewhere deep inside. He had been married for less than a year. No children. He loved repairing clocks. He carried that pocket watch everywhere. I looked down again. It suddenly seemed impossible that an object could belong so completely to someone I had never known. My brother used to joke that Thomas checked the time every 5 minutes. Samuel smiled faintly. He said Thomas trusted his watch more than the station clock. The smile disappeared almost immediately. Then came October 17th. The room grew quiet again. I leaned forward. What happened that night? Samuel rubbed his hands together. It had rained for 3 straight days. The tracks outside Easton were unstable. Everyone knew it, but freight schedules couldn't simply stop. He looked toward the window, seeing something far beyond the rain outside my house. My brother, Daniel, was only 23. He'd been hired 2 months earlier. He admired your father. Everyone did. Your father was calm. He never panicked. If something broke, he fixed it. If someone argued, he settled it. He wasn't the loudest man, but when he spoke, people listened. I smiled despite myself. That sounds like him. Samuel returned the smile. Some things never change. Then his face darkened. Late that afternoon, one of the freight cars slipped while they were switching tracks. The coupling failed. It shouldn't have, but it did. The car started rolling downhill. Fast. Too fast. I found myself holding my breath. There were workers on the lower tracks. They had almost no warning. My father. Samuel nodded. He ran toward them. Not away. Toward them. My eyes filled before I realized it. That sounded exactly like the father I had known. Always helping. Always putting others first. He shouted for everyone to move. Most did. But Thomas. Samuel looked again at the watch. He went back. Why? His toolbox. I frowned. What? He repaired clocks as a hobby. He carried his tools everywhere. They were inside the rail car. He thought he still had time. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He was wrong. I could almost see it unfolding. The rain. The steel tracks. Men shouting. The terrible sound of wheels racing downhill. My father tried to stop him. He chased after him. Daniel followed. They almost reached him. Samuel's voice became quieter. But then, he pointed once more at the watch. It happened. I swallowed. The impact. Samuel nodded. The collision threw Thomas nearly 20 feet. The watch struck the rail. The glass shattered. The mechanism stopped forever. I looked again at the frozen hands. 417. Not a random number. Not a broken mechanism. A moment. The exact second one man's life had ended. Without realizing it, I reached out and gently touched the cracked crystal. It suddenly felt far colder than brass should. My father. I whispered. He saw all of it. Samuel nodded slowly. He never forgot. Silence settled over us. After nearly a minute, Samuel reached into the inside pocket of his coat once more. This time, he removed something wrapped in brown paper. It was tied with faded string. I almost didn't bring this. What is it? My brother left instructions. He carefully untied the string. Inside was a thin leather notebook. Its corners were worn smooth. Across the front cover, barely visible beneath decades of scratches, were 2 initials. T.W. Thomas Whitaker. I stared at it in disbelief. Samuel gently slid it across the coffee table toward me. This belonged to the same man who owned the watch. I hesitated before touching it. The leather felt dry and brittle beneath my fingertips. There's something inside, Samuel said quietly. That explains why your father guarded that watch for the rest of his life. I slowly opened the notebook. The first few pages contained ordinary notes. Train schedules, repair measurements, shopping lists. Nothing unusual. Then, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. It landed softly on the table. The paper was much newer than the notebook itself. Someone had placed it there years later. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my heart begin to race. If anyone ever finds this watch. For several seconds, I simply stared at the folded sheet of paper. I recognized the handwriting instantly, even after 32 years. My father had written with slow, deliberate strokes, pressing the pen just hard enough to leave faint impressions on the back of the page. As a little girl, I used to watch him write grocery lists at the kitchen table. Every letter looked carefully placed, almost as though he believed words deserved patience. Now those same careful letters rested before me. If anyone ever finds this watch, I couldn't bring myself to unfold it. Not yet. My father had been gone for over 3 decades. I had mourned him, missed him, spoken to his photograph more times than I cared to admit. But this felt different. This wasn't a memory. It was his voice waiting for me. Samuel remained completely silent. He seemed to understand that whatever happened next belonged to me alone. My fingers trembled as I carefully unfolded the paper. The page had yellowed with age, but the ink remained surprisingly dark. At the very top, my father had written only one sentence. To whoever finally comes looking for this watch. I swallowed hard. Then I began to read aloud. If you are holding this letter, it means I have failed. Not because I wanted to, because time defeated me. For many years, I hoped someone from Thomas Whitaker's family would come to my door. Every spring, I expected a letter. Every autumn, I looked at every unfamiliar face that passed my house. No one ever came. If they have finally found this watch, then I ask only one thing. Please don't judge me before you know everything. I stopped reading. The room had become impossibly quiet. Samuel looked down at his hands. I've never heard the letter before, he whispered. My brother only knew it existed. I nodded and continued. Thomas was already dying before I reached him. No doctor could have changed that. No ambulance could have arrived in time. But I stayed beside him anyway. He was still breathing. Barely. He grabbed my coat with surprising strength. Then he placed this watch into my hand. I tried to give it back. He refused. He said something I never forgot. Don't let strangers sell my time. At first, I didn't understand. Then he smiled. The kind of smile only a man who knows he has only seconds left can give. He told me his wife was expecting him home for supper. He laughed softly and said she would probably complain that he was late again. Even then, he was trying to comfort me, not himself. My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes before the tears reached the paper. Samuel quietly handed me a handkerchief. I accepted it with a grateful nod, then continued reading. Thomas asked me to keep the watch until I could find his family. He gave me an address. I repeated it over and over so I would never forget. After the accident, I went there the very next morning. The house was empty. The neighbors told me his wife had already left. No forwarding address. No relatives nearby. Nothing. For months I searched, then years. Every lead disappeared. Every trail ended. Eventually people told me to move on. But how do you move on from a promise made to a dying man? I lowered the page. The question echoed inside me. How do you? It sounded exactly like something my father would ask. He had never abandoned a promise. Not once. Even when it cost him. I looked at Samuel. So he really tried. Samuel nodded. My brother always believed he did. I continued reading. As time passed, I began to fear something worse than failure. I feared dying before they found me. That is why I made my daughter promise never to sell the watch. She never knew why. I wanted her life to remain free from my burden. But I also hoped, perhaps after I was gone, someone would finally come. If you are reading this, then perhaps hope was not foolish after all. The words struck me harder than anything else. He had protected me. Not only the watch. Me. He had allowed me to believe I was guarding an old keepsake. All the while, I had unknowingly been carrying another man's final request. A responsibility my father never wished to force upon me. I turned the page. There was still more. The final section was shorter. The handwriting had become slightly shakier. Inside the back cover of Thomas's notebook is something I never understood. He begged me never to remove it. He told me his family would know what it meant. I kept that promise too. If his family has finally come, it belongs to them now. With gratitude, William Hayes. I looked up slowly. Samuel's expression had changed. He seemed almost afraid to breathe. The back cover. He whispered. I immediately picked up the notebook. Until that moment, I hadn't examined it closely. The leather binding appeared thicker than it should have. I gently turned it over. There was a narrow stitched compartment hidden beneath the inside cover, so perfectly made that I had overlooked it completely. Samuel leaned closer. My brother never mentioned that. I don't think he knew. Neither of us spoke. Carefully, very carefully, I slipped one finger beneath the old leather flap. Something thin rested inside. Not paper. Metal. I eased it out slowly. It was a small brass key, no larger than my little finger. Its surface was worn smooth from years of use. A tiny tag remained attached by faded thread. Only 3 words had been engraved into the brass. Union Safe Deposit. Samuel stared at the key in complete disbelief. I've heard that name before, he murmured. I turned the key over in my hand. There was a number stamped into the opposite side. 417. The room fell silent once again. The same number. The same time the watch had stopped. The same moment Thomas Whitaker had taken his last breath. My father hadn't been guarding only a watch. For 32 years, he had unknowingly protected the key to something that had waited, untouched, for more than 70 years. Neither Samuel nor I spoke for what felt like several minutes. The tiny brass key rested in the palm of my hand. It was astonishing how something so small could suddenly make the room feel so much larger. For decades, my father had protected it without ever knowing what it opened. Or perhaps he had known, and had simply chosen never to tell anyone. I looked at Samuel. Have you ever heard of Union Safe Deposit? He frowned. The name sounds familiar, but I can't remember why. I stood and walked to the bookshelf in the corner of my living room. Among old family albums and recipe books sat a thick county history volume my father had bought at a charity sale many years earlier. He loved local history. He often spent evenings reading about towns that no longer existed, factories that had closed, and railroads that had disappeared long before I was born. I pulled the heavy book from the shelf and carried it to the table. Dust rose from the cover. Samuel smiled faintly. He'd like knowing you still kept his books. I smiled back. He would. I opened the index. Banks. Financial institutions. Businesses. After a few minutes of searching, my finger stopped. Union Safe Deposit Company. Established 1919. Closed 1988. Relocated archives. Easton Historical Trust. Samuel leaned closer. It closed? So it says. He sighed. I suppose that means the box is gone. I wasn't convinced. There may still be records. He looked at me with cautious hope. You really think so? I don't know. But my father spent his entire life waiting. I closed the book. I'm not stopping now. Samuel looked away for a moment. When he turned back, I noticed his eyes had become slightly wet. My brother would have liked you. I laughed softly. He never met me. He didn't need to. He always said your father's family would finish what he couldn't. His words settled over me with unexpected weight. For the first time since opening the letter, I realized something. This wasn't just my father's unfinished promise anymore. It had quietly become mine. The next morning dawned clear and cool. The rain had disappeared overnight. Samuel had stayed in the small guest room. Neither of us had slept particularly well. Over breakfast, we said very little. Both of us kept glancing toward the pocket watch resting carefully inside its blue handkerchief. Neither of us wanted to leave it behind. After some discussion, I wrapped the watch, the notebook, the letter, and the brass key inside a small leather satchel. Before closing the front door, I paused. For reasons I couldn't explain, I looked toward my father's photograph hanging in the hallway. He smiled exactly as he always had. Calm, gentle, patient. I think we're finally going, I whispered. It felt almost foolish speaking aloud. Yet somehow, it also felt right. Easton was nearly 2 hours away. Samuel insisted on driving. The countryside rolled past in long stretches of farmland and old railway crossings. Many of the tracks no longer carried trains. Rust had replaced movement. Nature had begun reclaiming what industry had left behind. Samuel finally broke the silence. Your father loved these roads. You traveled together? A few times. What was he like when he was young? Samuel smiled. He laughed more. That surprised me. My father wasn't exactly serious.
No.
But life softened him. He became quieter after the accident. I looked out the window. I only knew that version. Samuel nodded. Most people did. After another mile, he added quietly, "Guilt changes people." Neither of us spoke again for several minutes. By late morning, we reached downtown Easton. Time had been kind to some buildings, cruel to others. The old railway station had become a museum. The freight yard no longer existed. Coffee shops occupied storefronts that had once sold tools and hardware. People hurried along the sidewalks without realizing how much history surrounded them. We parked beside a brick building with carved stone columns. Above the entrance stood a bronze plaque. Easton Historical Trust. This must be it. Samuel nodded. Inside, the building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A woman in her 60s looked up from the reception desk. "Good morning. Can I help you?" I stepped forward. "I hope so." She smiled kindly. "We'll certainly try." I carefully placed the brass key onto the counter. Her expression changed almost immediately. She picked it up with surprising delicacy. "I haven't seen one of these in years." Samuel and I exchanged a glance. "So it really belongs here?" "In a way." She turned the key over. "Union Safe Deposit closed decades ago." "What happened to the boxes?" "The city inherited responsibility for any unclaimed property." My pulse quickened. "So, they're stored beneath this building." Samuel inhaled sharply. The receptionist looked between us. "You have paperwork?" I placed my father's letter beside the key. Then Thomas Whitaker's notebook. Finally, the pocket watch. The woman froze. She picked up the watch carefully. Her eyes widened. "My grandfather," she whispered almost to herself, "used to talk about this." "You recognize it?" I recognized the story. She looked toward an elderly man organizing files at the far end of the room. "Mr. Collins?" The old archivist slowly approached. He adjusted his glasses. "What is it?" She silently handed him the watch. The moment he saw the frozen hands, his face lost all color. He stared at the time. 4:17. Then he looked at Samuel. Then at me. Finally, he whispered words neither of us expected. "I never thought anyone would bring this back." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "You know about it?" Mr. Collins nodded. "My father investigated the railway accident. He told me there was one safety deposit box nobody was ever allowed to open." Samuel frowned. "Why?" Mr. Collins looked down at the brass key. "Because no one could legally prove who owned it." I slowly lifted the notebook. "What if we can?" The old archivist smiled sadly. "If that's true." He looked toward a heavy steel door hidden behind the reception area. "Then you'll become the first people to open box 417 in 74 years. The words echoed through the quiet archive. Box 417. The same number engraved on the key. The same number frozen forever on the watch. The same moment that had changed 3 families. And perhaps many more. Mr. Collins reached into his pocket. He removed an old ring of keys. One by one, he unlocked the heavy steel door. It groaned as it slowly swung inward. A cold draft rose from the staircase below. He looked back at us. "The vault is still exactly as it was left." Then his expression grew unexpectedly serious. "But I should warn you. No one knows what's inside." And judging by the way my father spent the rest of his life protecting that watch, I'm not sure anyone was ever meant to. The heavy steel door closed behind us with a slow metallic echo. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the underground corridor, it sounded final, as though we had just crossed a threshold that separated the present from the past. Mr. Collins led the way, carrying an old brass lantern even though electric lights lined the ceiling. "The wiring isn't always reliable down here," he explained. "I've learned not to trust it." The narrow staircase descended nearly 20 feet beneath the building. Each step creaked softly beneath our weight. The air grew noticeably cooler. It carried the unmistakable scent of stone, dust, and old paper. This part of the building had survived 2 floods, 3 renovations, and nearly a century of changing ownership. Yet somehow, it felt untouched, as if time itself had forgotten it. When we reached the bottom, the corridor stretched before us like something preserved inside a museum. Rows of steel doors lined both walls.
Hundreds of them.
Each one no larger than a briefcase. Each marked with a number engraved into polished brass. Some bore fresh labels. Others had faded so badly they were barely readable. Samuel slowed his pace. My brother would have loved this place. Mr. Collins smiled. Most people don't even know it exists. We continued walking. Box 192. Box 264. Box 311. Each passing number seemed to make my heart beat a little faster. Without realizing it, I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around my father's watch. The familiar shape steadied me. Finally, Mr. Collins stopped. There, mounted at eye level, was a small brass plate. 417. The numbers were dark with age. The lock beneath them looked almost untouched. Mr. Collins examined it carefully. I've checked this box every few years for decades. No one has ever claimed it. He stepped aside. I believe this belongs to you now. He handed me the tiny brass key. For a moment, I simply looked at it. 74 years. Generations had come and gone while this key waited patiently for someone to return. I took a slow breath, then inserted it into the lock. At first, nothing happened. The mechanism resisted. Mr. Collins leaned closer. Try turning it gently. I did. A soft click echoed inside the steel door. Not loud. Not dramatic, just a quiet sound that had waited nearly 3/4 of a century to be heard. I pulled the small handle. The door opened only a few inches before stopping. Something inside prevented it from swinging farther. Samuel carefully reached forward. Together we eased it open. Inside rested a single wooden case, no larger than a shoebox. Mahogany. Its polished surface had dulled with age, but it remained beautifully crafted. A small brass plaque was fixed to the lid. The engraving was almost worn away. Mr. Collins adjusted the lantern. We leaned closer. Slowly, the letters became visible. Thomas Whitaker. No dates. No title. Just a name. Samuel whispered it aloud, almost like a prayer. I lifted the box from the compartment. It was surprisingly heavy. Heavier than documents alone could explain. We carried it to a nearby oak table that had likely stood there since the vault was built. No one hurried. There was no need. Whatever had waited this long could wait another minute. The box had no lock, only 2 brass clasps. My fingers rested on them, then stopped.
I suddenly realized something.
My father never opened this. Samuel looked at me.
No.
He could have. He chose not to. Mr. Collins nodded quietly. He honored another man's trust. I closed my eyes for just a second, then released the first clasp. The second followed. The lid lifted with surprising ease. Inside, there was no treasure, no gold, no stacks of money. Instead, everything had been packed with extraordinary care. Several tied bundles of letters, a leather-bound journal, a cloth pouch, a small velvet jewelry box, and beneath them, a thick envelope labeled simply, "For Margaret." Samuel looked puzzled. Who was Margaret? I remembered immediately. My father wrote that Thomas had a wife. Samuel nodded. That's right. Carefully, I lifted the envelope. The paper had yellowed, but the wax seal remained unbroken. No one had ever opened it, not even my father. Mr. Collins removed his glasses. I don't think I've ever seen a sealed letter survive this long. I turned the envelope over. On the back, in neat handwriting, Thomas had written only one sentence. If this reaches you, it means I couldn't come home. The words struck every one of us. Samuel quietly looked away. Mr. Collins lowered his head. I felt tears gather before I even realized I was crying. A man had written those words before leaving for work, expecting nothing more dangerous than an ordinary day. He never returned. Instead, his last message had slept beneath the earth for 74 years, waiting, patiently, silently. But something else inside the box caught my attention. Beneath the journal lay a folded newspaper clipping. Unlike everything else, it had already been opened. Someone had read it before placing it inside. I unfolded it carefully. The headline immediately caught my eye. Local worker blamed for rail disaster. Beneath the headline was a photograph. A young man standing outside the courthouse. His shoulders slumped, his expression hollow. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Daniel. It was my father. Samuel stared at the photograph in complete disbelief. He never told you. I could barely speak.
No.
Mr. Collins leaned closer to read the article. As his eyes moved across the page,
His face changed.
"This," he whispered. "This article shouldn't exist." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He slowly removed the clipping from my trembling hands, then pointed toward the byline printed beneath the headline. "The reporter who wrote this story,"
He paused.
"publicly admitted 20 years later that the entire article was false." The room became perfectly silent. If the newspaper had lied, then my father had carried the shame of a crime he never committed for the rest of his life. I looked at the faded newspaper clipping again. My father stood alone outside the courthouse. His head was lowered, not in guilt. Now that I looked more carefully, it seemed more like exhaustion. The photograph had captured a man who had already accepted something he could no longer change. Mr. Collins placed the clipping gently on the table. "I remember hearing about this article when I was a boy." "You do?" My father spoke about it several times. He always became angry whenever someone mentioned it. Why? Because he believed the newspaper ruined an innocent man's life. Samuel leaned closer. "What really happened?" Mr. Collins removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. "It was a difficult time. The railway company needed someone to blame. The accident had already become national news. 4 workers were dead. Dozens had been injured. Families wanted answers. The newspapers wanted headlines. The company wanted protection."
He sighed.
"Your father became the easiest target. I struggled to understand, but he tried to save people. So did several others." "Then why him?" Mr. Collins answered quietly. "Because heroes rarely own companies." The words settled heavily over the room. The investigation lasted only 9 days. Samuel frowned. "That seems incredibly fast." It was. The official conclusion claimed that a safety procedure had been ignored. "They said your father failed to secure one of the freight cars." I shook my head instinctively. "No." Mr. Collins nodded. "My father believed exactly the same thing. He investigated the accident independently after retiring." "What did he find?" "He discovered maintenance records. They showed the coupling mechanism had cracked weeks earlier. It had been reported. It had never been replaced." Samuel stared at him. "So the company already knew?" "Yes. They simply ignored it." Silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Not because of uncertainty, because of certainty. An old injustice had suddenly become real. I looked again at the photograph. All my life, I had known my father as a quiet man, reserved, patient, almost too humble. Neighbors respected him, but they never admired him the way they admired other men. There had always been whispers, little comments I never understood as a child. "Good man. Shame about what happened years ago. Hard-working fellow. If only that accident hadn't followed him." Whenever I asked my father about those remarks, he smiled gently. "It was a long time ago." Then he changed the subject. I never asked again. Now, I wished I had. Samuel suddenly spoke. "My brother knew the investigation was wrong." "You mean Daniel?" He nodded. "He tried to testify." "What happened?" "They wouldn't let him." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "The company lawyers claimed he had been too far away to see the accident clearly. But he wasn't. He was standing beside your father. So they ignored him? Worse." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They threatened to fire him." The room grew quiet again. My brother had a wife, 2 little girls. He stayed silent. I could hear the regret in Samuel's voice. He regretted that decision every day for the rest of his life. He looked directly at me. He always said your father paid the price for everyone else's fear. I lowered my eyes. Suddenly, I understood something that had puzzled me for decades. Every year, on October 17th, my father disappeared after breakfast. He never told anyone where he went. He returned just before sunset. His clothes always smelled faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves. My mother never questioned him. Neither did I. It had become one of those family habits everyone accepts without explanation. I looked at Samuel. Do you know where he went every October? Samuel answered without hesitation. The cemetery. My breath caught. He visited all 4 graves, not just Thomas Whitaker's. All 4 men who had died that afternoon. He cleaned the headstones, left fresh flowers, and apologized. I felt tears rise again. He apologized? Samuel nodded slowly. Every year. My brother went with him twice. He said your father stood there for nearly an hour. He spoke to them as though they could hear him. What did he say? Samuel's voice became almost a whisper. He always repeated the same sentence. I'm sorry I couldn't save all of you. No one spoke after that. The silence itself seemed to honor the man we were remembering. Eventually, Mr. Collins carefully turned another page inside Thomas Whitaker's journal. Something small slid free. A folded receipt. Old. Brittle. The ink had nearly disappeared. He unfolded it carefully. At the top appeared the date. October 16th, 1951. The day before the accident. Below it, a repair order. Replacement coupling assembly. Status. Delayed. Mr. Collins looked up immediately. This. He swallowed. This proves the company knew the equipment was unsafe before the accident. Samuel stared at the paper. My brother searched for this. For years. He thought it had been destroyed. I carefully took the receipt into my hands. It weighed almost nothing, yet it carried enough truth to change history. Mr. Collins looked toward the ceiling thoughtfully. The railway company no longer exists, but its records do. What does that mean? He smiled faintly. It means your father's name could finally be cleared. The possibility felt almost unreal. For 32 years, I had believed my father died carrying an unanswered promise. Now I was discovering he had carried something even heavier. A public accusation he never deserved. Samuel looked at me. What do you want to do? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked once more at my father's photograph in the newspaper. The young man standing outside the courthouse. Alone. Condemned by strangers. Misunderstood by history. Then I looked at the pocket watch resting beside Thomas's sealed letter. The hands still pointed to 417. Frozen forever. Not as a reminder of failure, but of the exact moment one honest man chose to carry another family's hope, even while the world chose to blame him. I took a deep breath. I think, I said quietly, it's finally time my father came home. Samuel frowned gently. What do you mean? I looked at the evidence spread across the table. The receipt, the journal, the letter,
The watch. The key.
My father spent the rest of his life protecting another man's story. I closed the journal carefully. Now, it's our turn to protect his. Just then, Mr. Collins reached into the bottom of the wooden box. There appears to be one more compartment. None of us had noticed it before. Hidden beneath a false wooden base was a thin envelope tied with blue ribbon. Across the front, in Thomas Whitaker's handwriting, were words that made all 3 of us fall silent. To be opened only if I never return. For a long moment, none of us reached for the envelope. It rested quietly on the oak table. The faded blue ribbon was still tied exactly as Thomas Whitaker had left it more than 70 years earlier. No fingerprints. No torn edges. No broken seal. Time itself seemed to have protected it. Mr. Collins removed his glasses once again. I've spent 40 years working with historical documents. His voice was barely above a whisper. I've handled presidential letters, military records, family journals. He looked at the envelope. But I've never held something that waited this long to be read. Neither had I. The room felt almost sacred. Samuel stood with both hands resting on the back of a wooden chair. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. I could see the emotion in his face. His brother, Daniel, had spent most of his life believing this letter was lost forever.
Now,
It had found its way back, not through chance, but through promises. One promise made by a dying man, another kept by my father, and finally, one completed by us. I looked at the ribbon. Should we open it? Samuel answered softly. I think Thomas intended someone to. Mr. Collins nodded. If not us, perhaps no one ever would. Carefully, I untied the ribbon. The fabric had become fragile with age. It slipped free without resistance. Inside lay several folded pages. The handwriting matched the notebook perfectly.
neat.
Confident, patient. I unfolded the first page. At the top, only 2 words. My Margaret. I swallowed, then began reading aloud. If you are reading this letter, something has gone terribly wrong. Please don't cry before you finish. If I have failed to come home, know this first. The happiest years of my life were the ordinary ones. The mornings when you complained that I left my boots by the door. The evenings when we shared cold pie because neither of us wanted to cook. The Sundays when we pretended not to notice the church bell because we preferred sitting together on the porch. People think happiness comes from extraordinary moments. They are mistaken. It lives quietly inside ordinary days. Thank you for giving me so many of them. I paused. My eyes had already filled with tears. Samuel stared silently at the floor. Mr. Collins closed his eyes. No one wanted to interrupt. I continued. Please forgive me for leaving before repairing the kitchen window. I know you'll laugh when you read that. You always said I'd rather fix clocks than fix the house. You were probably right. There are things I wanted to build. A bigger porch. A workshop behind the garden. A swing for the children we hoped would someday fill our home.
Perhaps someone else will build those now.
If they do, smile for me. The room grew even quieter. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with grand speeches. That somehow made it even more heartbreaking. Thomas wasn't writing history. He was writing to the woman he loved, expecting she might one day need these words. I turned the page. The handwriting became slightly less steady. There is one thing I never told you, not because I wished to hide it, because I hoped I would have many years left to explain. In the safety deposit box, you will find everything we saved together. Not riches, not fortunes, simply enough for a peaceful beginning. If someone honest returns the key, trust that person, because no dishonest man would carry another person's burden for so many years. I stopped reading. Samuel slowly looked toward my father's watch. Thomas had trusted a man he barely knew, and somehow he had been right. I continued. If William Hayes is the one reading this, then I must say something to him as well. William, if I did not survive, do not waste your life carrying guilt that belongs to no one. Accidents do not ask permission. They do not choose good men or bad men. If you remember me laughing. Remember me complaining about my watch running 2 minutes low. Remember Margaret. Remember the life I was lucky enough to live. But do not punish yourself for the years I could not. Live yours. That is the only favor I ask. The words echoed through the room. No one spoke, because we all understood the terrible irony. My father had spent more than 40 years doing the exact opposite. He had carried guilt Thomas had begged him to release. He had apologized every October, protected the watch, protected the key, protected a promise. Yet he had never forgiven himself. My heart broke all over again, not because my father had failed, but because he had never believed he deserved peace. I turned to the final page. There was one last paragraph, written more boldly than the others, almost as though Thomas wanted to make certain no one would ever overlook it. One last request. Please never remember me because I died. Remember me because I loved. Love is the only thing that survives longer than grief. If Margaret ever grows old without me, tell her I was thinking about her when my watch stopped. The last sentence barely left my lips before silence filled the vault. Samuel wiped his eyes openly. Mr. Collins turned away, pretending to examine the shelves. I folded the pages carefully. No one rushed to speak. Some moments deserve silence more than words. After nearly a full minute, Samuel finally whispered, "My brother searched for Margaret until the day he died." I looked up. Did he ever find her? Samuel slowly shook his head.
No.
She disappeared a few weeks after the accident. Mr. Collins frowned thoughtfully. Disappeared? No one knew where she went. She sold the house, left town, and vanished. He looked at Thomas's letter. Perhaps she never knew this existed. I carefully returned the pages to the envelope. Then something caught my eye. The inside flap wasn't flat. There seemed to be another folded sheet tucked behind the lining. I gently separated the old paper. A second note slipped into my hand, much smaller, folded only once. Across the front, in different handwriting, were words that immediately made my pulse race. They were not written by Thomas. They were written by my father. For Margaret, if I ever find you. I held the second letter carefully between my fingers. Unlike Thomas's message, this envelope looked newer. Not new, just less old. The paper had yellowed only slightly. The folds were still firm. The edges had not begun to crumble. My father must have written it years after the accident, perhaps decades later. The handwriting confirmed it. It was unmistakably his. Older, slightly less steady, but still careful, still deliberate. Across the front, he had written only one line. For Margaret, if I ever find you. No address, no stamp, no date, just hope. Hope that had never found its destination. I looked at Samuel. I don't think he ever mailed it. Samuel shook his head. I don't think he ever knew where to. Mr. Collins nodded quietly. It explains why it stayed with the watch. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet. Nothing more. No photographs. No certificates. No legal documents. Just my father's words. I took a slow breath and began reading. Dear Margaret, you do not know me. Perhaps you never will. My name is William Hayes. I worked beside your husband. There is no sentence I can write that will soften what happened. I have started this letter more than 20 times. Every version ended in the fireplace, because I never found words worthy of the man I failed to bring home. I stopped for a moment. The phrase pierced me. The man I failed to bring home. Even after everything Thomas had written, my father still believed he had failed. I continued. Thomas spent his final moments thinking about you. Not the accident. Not the pain. Not himself. He spoke about your kitchen window. He worried you would pretend to fix it yourself. He laughed. Even then, he made me promise to protect his watch until I found you. I promised him. I have never broken that promise. Samuel quietly lowered his head. He remembered. He whispered. He remembered every word. I nodded and kept reading. I searched everywhere I knew. I visited your old house more times than I can count. I asked neighbors, churches, railway offices, postmasters, county clerks. Every lead disappeared. Sometimes I wondered if I had simply arrived too late. Other times, I prayed that perhaps you had found peace somewhere beyond my reach. The words became increasingly personal, less like a letter, more like a confession. If this letter somehow reaches you many years from now, please know that I carry Thomas's watch not because I believed it belonged to me. I carried it because I believed hope deserved somewhere safe to live. Every time I looked at it, I reminded myself that somewhere in this country there might still be someone waiting for answers. If that someone is you, I am sorry. Not because I stopped searching. Because I never found you. My eyes blurred again. I folded the page halfway closed. I've never seen him speak about himself this way. Samuel smiled sadly. Your father rarely did. He always preferred talking about other people. I looked back down. There was still one final section. The handwriting had become noticeably shakier, almost fragile. There is something else I must tell you. The newspapers lied. The accident was not Thomas's fault, nor mine. The railway knew the equipment had failed, but they needed someone ordinary enough to carry extraordinary blame. I accepted that burden, not because I believed I deserved it, because fighting them would have taken years. And every year spent in court would have been another year spent not looking for you. If choosing silence gave me more time to keep my promise, then silence was a price worth paying. The room disappeared around me. For a moment I heard nothing. Not the ventilation. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Only those words. My father had not remained silent because he was weak. He had remained silent because he believed searching for Margaret mattered more than clearing his own name. Samuel whispered the thought that had just formed in my own mind. He sacrificed his reputation to keep looking. I nodded slowly. He did. Mr. Collins stood motionless. I don't believe I've ever met a man like your father. Neither had I. Not until today. Growing up, I thought I knew him. I knew his favorite chair, his favorite songs, his habit of whistling while repairing broken furniture, the way he always let me win at checkers until I was old enough to notice. But this man, the man inside these letters, I was only meeting him now, decades after saying goodbye. I read the final lines. If this letter reaches no one, if it remains hidden forever, then perhaps one day my daughter will find it. If she does, I hope she understands why I asked her never to sell the watch. I never wanted to give her my burden, only my promise. She deserved a life lighter than mine. If she is reading these words, tell her I loved her more than any promise I ever kept. And if she chooses to stop carrying this watch, she has already done more than enough. With respect, William Hayes. I couldn't finish the last sentence aloud. The tears came too quickly. I pressed the letter gently against my chest. For the first time since my father died, I felt as though he had spoken directly to me. Not through memory, not through photographs, but through his own words. Samuel quietly rested a hand on my shoulder. He'd be proud of you. I managed a faint smile. I hope so. Mr. Collins carefully gathered the documents into neat piles. As he lifted the false wooden bottom of the mahogany box to return everything, he suddenly stopped. There appears to be something else. We leaned closer. Hidden beneath the lining, almost invisible, lay a narrow cloth pouch tied with faded green string. It was much smaller than the others. No label, no writing, no indication of what it contained. Samuel frowned. Was that there before? Mr. Collins slowly shook his head. I don't think any of us noticed it. He carefully handed the pouch to me. It felt unexpectedly heavy. Metal. Several small objects. I loosened the string. Turned the pouch over. 3 items slid gently onto the oak table. A plain gold wedding ring. A silver locket. And a tiny brass railroad whistle attached to a worn leather cord. The whistle was engraved with just 4 words. Return this to Emily. None of us knew who Emily was. But deep inside, I had the unmistakable feeling that our journey wasn't over yet. None of us touched the whistle at first. It lay on the table beside the wedding ring and the silver locket, catching the soft light from Mr. Collins' lantern. The engraving was simple, not decorative, not ceremonial, just 4 carefully stamped words. Return this to Emily. Samuel was the first to speak. My brother never mentioned an Emily. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses. Neither did the records I've seen. I picked up the whistle. The brass had become smooth with age, polished by countless hands long before it disappeared into the mahogany box. A faded leather cord remained attached. The leather had cracked over the decades, but someone had repaired it once with neat, careful stitches. Someone who believed it was worth saving. Much like the watch. I turned it over. There was something engraved on the opposite side. Not a name.
A date.
May 3rd, 1949. Nearly 2 years before the railway accident. I looked at Samuel. Thomas couldn't have engraved this after the accident.
No.
So Emily already mattered before everything happened. Mr. Collins leaned over the table. There may be something inside. I frowned. Inside the whistle? He nodded. Some railway whistles were designed to unscrew for cleaning. I examined it more closely. Sure enough, a narrow seam circled the middle. Very carefully, I twisted the 2 halves apart. At first, they refused to move. Then, with gentle pressure, the metal loosened. A tiny rolled piece of paper slid into my palm. We all stared. No one expected that. The paper was scarcely larger than my little finger. It had been protected perfectly inside the whistle all these years. I unfolded it with extraordinary care. The handwriting was different from both Thomas's and my father's. Smaller, rounder, more graceful. A woman's handwriting. Only one sentence had been written. If you ever lose your way, follow the oak tree. Nothing else. No signature. No address. No explanation. Samuel frowned. What does that mean? I don't know. Mr. Collins looked thoughtful. Oak trees were often used as landmarks before rural roads were numbered. So, it could be a location. Possibly. I folded the tiny note again. Or a memory. The room fell silent. There were now more questions than answers. Who was Emily? Why had Thomas hidden a message inside a whistle? Why had he wanted it returned? And why had no one ever spoken about her? As I looked back into the mahogany box, something finally caught my attention. The cloth lining had worn thin near one corner. Almost invisible beneath it, someone had stitched 3 tiny initials. E.W. I blinked. Samuel leaned closer. What is it? I pointed. E.W. He frowned. Emily Whittaker? Mr. Collins slowly nodded. That would make sense. I looked up. Thomas's daughter? Samuel immediately shook his head. He and Margaret never had children. I remembered the letter. Thomas himself had written those words. A swing for the children we hoped would someday fill our home. No, Emily couldn't have been their daughter. Then, who was she? Mr. Collins remained unusually quiet. Finally, he said, There is one place we haven't looked. The personnel records. I frowned. The railway still has them?
No.
But copies were donated to the Historical Trust. He looked toward the archive room upstairs. If Emily worked for the railway, we might find her. Nearly an hour later, we sat around a long wooden table covered with employee ledgers. Each book weighed several pounds. The pages were handwritten. Names, departments, addresses, employment dates. Thousands of workers. Some had stayed only weeks, others their entire lives. Mr. Collins began searching the records from 1949. Samuel searched 1950. I searched 1951. The hours slipped by almost unnoticed. Outside, afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall archive windows. Dust floated lazily in the golden beams. The building had become so quiet that every turning page sounded unusually loud. Then, Samuel suddenly stopped. I found an Emily. I looked up immediately. So did I. Mr. Collins hurried over. Samuel pointed first. Emily Walker, office clerk. Employed 6 months. No further information. Then I looked at my own page. Emily Whittaker, emergency communications, railway dispatch office. Age 21. Address. My heart skipped. The address matched Thomas Whittaker's home. Samuel leaned closer. She lived with him. Mr. Collins read carefully. Relationship listed as. He paused. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked at us with obvious surprise. Not wife. Not daughter. Not sister. What does it say? He slowly turned the ledger toward us. The faded ink was still readable. Niece. Samuel exhaled. So Thomas had family. I continued reading. Employment status. Resigned. October 18th, 1951. The day after the accident. Exactly 1 day later. No forwarding address. No destination. No explanation. Only one word. Resigned. Samuel looked puzzled. Why would she disappear? I wasn't sure, but something inside me whispered the answer. Maybe she hadn't disappeared. Maybe she had been running. Mr. Collins closed the ledger gently. I think we need to find Emily Whittaker. Samuel gave a tired smile. If she's still alive. I quietly did the math. 21 years old in 1951. She would now be 96. Possible. Unlikely. But possible. Just then, Mr. Collins reached beneath the ledger to return it to the shelf. A folded county map slipped out from between the pages. It clearly didn't belong there. Someone had hidden it years ago. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were two words. My father's handwriting. The Oak. Every hair on my arm stood up. I unfolded the map. Near the edge of Easton County, a single red circle had been drawn around an isolated farmhouse. Beside it, only one handwritten sentence. She said she'd wait there every Sunday. For several seconds, I couldn't take my eyes off the map. The red circle had faded over the years, but it was still unmistakable. My father's handwriting was just as steady as it had been in every letter we had found. She said she'd wait there every Sunday. No name, no explanation, just that one sentence. Samuel slowly sat down. So, he found her. I looked at him. Maybe. But if he found her, why didn't he give her the watch? Neither of us had an answer. Mr. Collins carefully unfolded the county map completely across the table. It was printed in 1952. Many of the roads no longer existed. Some had been renamed decades earlier. Others had disappeared beneath newer highways. He traced one thin dirt road with his finger. This farm, he murmured. I know where it used to be. You've been there? Once. When I was a teenager. It belonged to the Harper family. What happened to it? It was abandoned sometime in the 70s. He looked thoughtful. But the old oak tree. He smiled faintly. I remember that. You couldn't miss it. Samuel leaned over the map. It says less than 12 miles from here. I looked out the archive window. The afternoon sun was already beginning to sink lower in the sky. If we leave now, we can still make it before dark. The drive took less than half an hour. The paved road gradually became gravel, then dirt. Fields stretched endlessly on both sides. Tall grass swayed in the warm breeze. Here and there, old fence posts leaned at impossible angles. Nature had slowly reclaimed the countryside. No houses, no traffic, no sounds except birds and the tires crunching over loose stone. Finally, Mr. Collins slowed the car. I think this is it. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, beyond a line of overgrown bushes, the farmhouse emerged. Or what remained of it. The roof had partially collapsed. Several windows were broken. The porch sagged badly. Wild vines climbed the walls. But standing proudly beside the house was an enormous oak tree. Even after all these years, it was magnificent. Its branches stretched across nearly half the yard. The trunk was so wide that 3 grown adults couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. I remembered the tiny note hidden inside the whistle. Follow the oak tree. We had. Samuel whispered almost to himself. I think we're exactly where Thomas wanted us to be. We stepped carefully through the waist-high grass. The silence felt different here. Not empty. Peaceful. Almost welcoming. As we reached the oak tree, I noticed something unusual. The bark on one side had been scarred many years earlier. 2 initials had been carved into it.
TW.
Below them, much smaller, another pair. EW. Samuel ran his fingers gently across the carving. Thomas. He smiled sadly. And Emily. Not Margaret. Emily. They had stood beneath this very tree together. Years before the accident. Mr. Collins slowly circled the trunk. There are more carvings. We followed him. There, nearly hidden beneath moss, was a small heart. Inside it, 3 initials. TMW. Thomas. Margaret. Whitaker. Someone had carved it with obvious care. Probably newly married. Probably believing they had decades ahead of them. I felt an ache in my chest. So much hope had lived beneath this tree. Then, something caught my eye. At the base of the trunk, half buried beneath leaves, stood a small stone marker, no larger than a brick. I knelt carefully, brushed away dirt and moss. Simple lettering slowly appeared.
Sunday.
Nothing else. Just one word.
Sunday.
Samuel frowned. What does that mean? I looked toward the map in my pocket. She said she'd wait there every Sunday. The realization came almost immediately. This wasn't a grave. Mr. Collins nodded. It was a meeting place. Someone had marked it. Not for strangers. For 2 people who understood its meaning. Samuel looked around quietly. If Emily waited here, Perhaps my father met her. I stood slowly. He must have. Otherwise, he couldn't have written that sentence. But then, Samuel looked genuinely confused. Why did he still keep the watch? The question lingered between us. None of the evidence fit together. Until Mr. Collins noticed something beneath the stone marker. There appears to be a hinge. A hinge. He crouched beside it. Very gently, he lifted the flat stone. It wasn't a marker at all. It was a cover. Hidden beneath it, a small iron box had been buried in the earth. Rust covered nearly every inch. Yet somehow, it remained intact. Samuel stared in disbelief. How many secrets did these people hide? Mr. Collins laughed softly. Apparently, quite a few. The iron box had no lock. Only rust. Carefully, using the small folding knife he always carried, Samuel loosened the lid. It resisted at first, then slowly opened.
Inside,
Everything had been wrapped in oilcloth, protected against moisture, protected against time. I carefully unfolded the bundle. There was only one object inside. A leather-bound appointment diary. Its pages had swollen slightly from age. Across the cover, embossed in faded gold letters, Emily Whittaker. My heartbeat quickened. Samuel looked at me. This is hers. I slowly opened the diary. Most pages contained ordinary notes. Train schedules, groceries, telephone numbers, birthdays. Nothing unusual. Until I reached October 1951. Every Sunday before the accident had been marked with a single word. William, not Thomas. William.
my father.
Samuel frowned. They were meeting. I nodded slowly. Every Sunday. Then I turned to the page dated October 21st, 1951. The first Sunday after the accident. Instead of a name, Emily had written only one sentence. One sentence that suddenly explained everything. He came, but he brought the watch instead of Thomas. I felt tears sting my eyes. For the first time, I could picture it perfectly. My father walking beneath this enormous oak, holding the pocket watch, knowing Thomas would never come again, trying to keep the promise he had made, trying to find words no one should ever have to speak. I turned the page. There was one final entry, written a week later. The handwriting shook badly. The ink had blurred in several places. Yet one sentence remained perfectly readable. I asked him never to stop looking for Aunt Margaret. I closed the diary slowly. Now, I understood. Emily hadn't disappeared because she was running. She had sent my father on one last mission, one he had faithfully carried for the rest of his life. Just then, a car door slammed somewhere beyond the trees. All three of us looked toward the road. An old pickup truck had stopped beside the abandoned farmhouse. A white-haired woman stepped out slowly with the help of a cane. She looked toward the oak tree, then toward us. And before anyone could say a single word, she whispered from across the field, "You're finally here." Then her eyes fell upon the pocket watch in my hands. She covered her mouth and began to cry. For a few moments, no one moved. The old woman stood beside her weathered pickup truck, one hand gripping a wooden cane, the other covering her trembling mouth. The wind carried the loose strands of her white hair across her face. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on only one thing, the pocket watch. The same watch my father had protected for more than 40 years. The same watch that had traveled through 3 generations before finding its way back to this field. I looked at Samuel. His face had turned pale. He whispered almost to himself, "Could it really be?" The woman slowly began walking toward us. Each step was careful, measured, not because she was afraid, because age had taught her patience. Mr. Collins instinctively stepped aside, giving her room to approach. No one interrupted. When she finally stopped beneath the great oak tree, she looked directly at me. Her voice was gentle. "So," she whispered, "William finally kept his promise." The words settled over us like the last piece of a puzzle. I felt my throat tighten. "You knew my father." She smiled. I knew the kind of man he was. There was no hesitation in her answer. No uncertainty. Only affection. Only gratitude. I carefully held out the watch. The woman reached toward it with both hands. Not greedily. Almost reverently. Her fingertips barely touched the worn brass case. She closed her eyes, then smiled through tears. He polished this every Sunday. My heart skipped. How do you know that? She opened her eyes again. Because. She answered softly. I watched him do it. None of us spoke. The silence invited her story. After several moments, she looked at Samuel. You must be Daniel's little brother. Samuel's eyes widened. You remember me? You were only a boy. You came here once with Daniel. You picked wildflowers. Samuel laughed through his tears. I had forgotten. I never did. The old woman smiled warmly. My memory isn't what it used to be, but some days stay with us forever. She looked back at me. My name is Emily. The name echoed gently beneath the branches. Not a mystery anymore. Not a clue hidden inside a whistle. A real person. Standing before us.
Alive.
96 years old. Still carrying the past with remarkable grace. I felt an overwhelming urge to embrace her. Instead, I simply reached for her hand. She squeezed mine surprisingly firmly. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. I smiled through tears. So have I. We sat together beneath the oak tree. Mr. Collins spread an old blanket from the back of his car across the grass. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the enormous branches. Birds sang somewhere above us. The entire place felt strangely untouched by time. Emily looked toward the farmhouse. My Uncle Thomas loved this tree. So did Aunt Margaret. They were married right over there. She pointed toward a patch of grass beside the porch. No church. No fancy reception. Just family. And lemonade. Samuel smiled. That sounds like Thomas. Emily laughed quietly. It does. For several minutes, she simply looked at the watch resting in her lap.
Then
she finally spoke about the accident. I wasn't at the railway that day. I was working in dispatch. When we heard,
her voice faltered.
We all ran. She looked away toward the distant road. I found William sitting beside Uncle Thomas. He still had blood on his hands. He wouldn't let anyone move. He kept saying, I'm still here. She closed her eyes briefly, as though he believed leaving Thomas alone would somehow make him disappear. I felt tears rising again. My father never spoke about that day. Emily nodded slowly. I know. He never spoke much after that. The breeze lifted a few fallen leaves around us. She continued. 3 days later, he came here. He carried the watch. He apologized before saying a single word. I remembered the diary. He came, but he brought the watch instead of Thomas. Emily smiled sadly. He tried to give it to me, but I wouldn't take it. I frowned. You refused? Yes. Why? She looked directly at me. Because it wasn't mine. It belonged to Margaret. That answer surprised all of us. But Thomas asked William to protect it. He did. And William wanted desperately to finish that promise. She gently ran one finger across the cracked crystal. But I knew something he didn't. What? Emily smiled faintly. Margaret had already left. I leaned forward. Did you know where she went? Yes. Did my father? Emily slowly shook her head.
No.
He begged me to tell him. I couldn't. Why not? Her eyes filled. Because I promised her. The words landed heavily between us. Another promise. Another burden. Another life shaped by loyalty. Samuel asked quietly, Did Margaret ask you to keep her location secret? Emily nodded. She believed William deserved freedom. I didn't understand at first, but she told me something I'll never forget. Emily looked toward the horizon, as though she could still hear Margaret's voice. If William finds me, Emily paused. He'll spend the rest of his life apologizing. No one interrupted. And Thomas would never forgive me for allowing that. The wind rustled through the oak leaves above us. Emily smiled sadly. So, I kept my promise. I let William keep looking, even though I knew where she was. My heart broke all over again. Not because anyone had acted cruelly, because everyone had acted out of love. Thomas wanted William to live. Margaret wanted William to forgive himself. Emily wanted to honor Margaret. My father wanted to honor Thomas. Every one of them had protected someone else. Even when it hurt, Emily reached into the pocket of her old cardigan. She removed a tiny photograph. The edges were soft from years of being handled. She handed it to me. It showed my father, older now, perhaps 60, standing beneath this very oak tree. He was smiling. Beside him stood Emily. Both of them were looking toward the empty road, as though waiting for someone. On the back of the photograph, in my father's handwriting, were 7 words. Maybe next Sunday she'll finally come home. A tear slipped down my cheek. He never stopped believing. Emily smiled.
No.
He came here every October, every Christmas, and she laughed softly. Almost every Sunday for 43 years. Samuel lowered his head. He never missed one? Emily looked at the watch. Not once. The afternoon had begun turning golden. Long shadows stretched across the field. Emily carefully closed the watch in her hands, then looked directly at me. There is one last thing your father never knew. My heartbeat quickened. What is it? Emily hesitated. For the first time that afternoon, she seemed genuinely uncertain. Finally, she whispered, Margaret didn't disappear forever. I stared at her. She's still alive. The world around me seemed to stop. Samuel's eyes widened. Mr. Collins nearly dropped the notebook he had been holding. Emily slowly nodded. She's 100 years old now. Then she looked at the watch once more. And she's been waiting to see it, one last time. For several long moments, no one said a word. Even the breeze seemed to disappear. The oak leaves, which had been whispering softly above us all afternoon, became strangely still. I looked at Emily, convinced I had misunderstood her. Margaret, I said carefully, is alive. Emily nodded.
Slowly.
Deliberately. As far as I know. My heart began beating faster. 100 years old. Emily smiled gently. She celebrated her birthday in February. Samuel sat back, unable to hide his disbelief. My brother searched for her until he died. Emily lowered her eyes. I know. He never stopped. My father never stopped either. I know. Neither accusation nor defense existed in her voice. Only sadness. The sadness of someone who had spent 70 years carrying a secret that had once seemed necessary. I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me. Where is she? Emily remained silent for several seconds. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. About 40 miles from here. I stared at her. 40 miles? Yes. So close. Emily nodded. So painfully close. I felt a strange ache in my chest. For more than 4 decades, my father had driven hundreds of miles, visited churches, county offices, old neighbors, railway records. Yet the woman he had been searching for had lived less than an hour away. The thought was almost unbearable. Emily seemed to read my expression. It wasn't your father's fault. He searched honestly. I simply kept my promise. She looked toward the old farmhouse. The roads changed. The towns changed. Names changed. And
She paused.
I became very good at saying nothing. There was no pride in that confession. Only regret. Samuel gently touched her arm. You were protecting Margaret. Emily nodded. She had already buried her husband. She didn't want William to spend the rest of his life buried beside him. The words lingered between us. I understood them, but that didn't make them hurt any less. After a long silence, Emily reached into the canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. I suppose, she said softly, it's time. She removed a small bundle wrapped in white linen. The fabric was clean despite its age. It had clearly been cared for. Very carefully, she unfolded it. Inside lay several old photographs. One by one, she placed them on the blanket. The first showed Thomas and Margaret standing outside a modest white church. Newly married, both laughing. Thomas held his hat in one hand. Margaret clutched a tiny bouquet of wildflowers. The second photograph showed Thomas kneeling beneath the very oak tree where we now sat. He was carving something into the bark. Emily laughed quietly. I took that picture. I looked closer. He was carving the initials we had discovered only an hour earlier.
TMW.
Suddenly, the carvings no longer felt like history. They felt alive. Then Emily placed a third photograph on the blanket. My breath caught. It showed my father, much older now, standing beside Emily, both smiling. But this time, there was someone else. An elderly woman stood a few feet behind them. She wasn't facing the camera. Only her back was visible. She wore a light blue coat, a white hat, and held a walking stick. I looked up. Who is this? Emily smiled through tears. Margaret. I stared at the photograph again. You mean, my father actually saw her? Emily nodded. Once. When? 26 years after the accident. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He found her?
No.
He almost did. Emily pointed toward the woman in the blue coat. Margaret had agreed to meet him. But at the last moment, Emily swallowed. She couldn't. What happened? She watched him from across the road. My chest tightened. My father never knew?
No.
He believed she hadn't come. Emily looked down at the photograph. But she was there. She stood behind the old mill. She watched him wait beneath this tree for almost 3 hours. The image formed vividly in my mind. My father sitting patiently beneath the oak, the pocket watch resting in his hand, looking down the road every few minutes, believing he had been forgotten. While only a few hundred feet away, the woman he had spent half his life searching for stood hidden behind an old stone wall, watching him,
Crying.
unable to take another step. I whispered, "Why?" Emily closed her eyes. Because she believed seeing him would destroy the life he had built. She took a slow breath. She had remarried. The word surprised me. Several years after Thomas died. It wasn't easy, but eventually, she found kindness again. I smiled faintly. I'm glad. So was William. I frowned. What do you mean? Emily looked directly at me. He already knew. I blinked. What? He learned she had remarried. When? Years before that meeting. But he never told anyone. He simply smiled. And said. Emily's voice softened. Then Thomas would be happy. I covered my face for a moment. How could one man carry so much grace? How could he love people so completely? Even when they unknowingly broke his heart. Emily reached for the final photograph. Unlike the others, it was recent. Perhaps only 5 years old. It showed Margaret sitting in a wheelchair outside a small white house. Her hair was completely silver, her face deeply lined. Yet, she was smiling. In her lap rested something familiar. Not the watch. A framed newspaper clipping. The same photograph of my father outside the courthouse. Across the glass frame, someone had written by hand, "The man who kept his promise." I stared at it in disbelief. Margaret had known. She had known the truth all along. She had known my father had never abandoned Thomas. She had known he had spent decades searching for her. And every day, she had honored him in return. Emily gently gathered the photographs back into the linen cloth. Then she looked at me with quiet determination. If you're willing, she said, I think it's finally time. My heartbeat quickened again. Time for what? Emily smiled. To finish the promise William began. I looked toward the pocket watch resting in my hands. Its frozen hands still pointed to 4:17. For 74 years, it had waited for this journey to end. Emily slowly stood with the help of her cane. Then she looked down the country road, leading away from the farmhouse. Margaret lives just beyond the next county. She smiled warmly. And I think she deserves to hear William's voice one last time. I looked at the letters resting inside my satchel. The one Thomas had written. The one my father had never been able to deliver. Tomorrow, for the first time in 74 years, both letters would finally reach the woman they had always belonged to. We agreed not to leave that evening. Not because we had changed our minds. Because some journeys deserve to begin in the morning. Emily insisted we spend the night in Easton. You've waited 74 years, she said with a gentle smile. One more sunrise won't matter. She was right. Still, I barely slept. The letters rested on the bedside table of my small hotel room. Thomas's final letter to Margaret. My father's unfinished letter. The pocket watch wrapped inside the faded blue handkerchief. Several times during the night, I woke and looked at them, not to make sure they were still there, to remind myself that everything that had happened wasn't a dream. By dawn, I was already dressed. When I opened the curtains, the sky was painted with soft shades of gold and pale blue. It felt like one of those mornings my father used to love, the kind that promised nothing extraordinary, and somehow changed everything. Emily arrived shortly after 8. She wore the same blue cardigan, the same careful smile, but today, there was something lighter in her eyes, almost peaceful. Samuel loaded the satchel into the back seat. Mr. Collins carried the mahogany box. None of us spoke very much. Words suddenly seemed too small. The drive took just under an hour. We left the main highway and followed a narrow country road lined with maple trees. Small farms appeared every few miles, some freshly painted, others quietly surrendering to time. Emily directed us, without hesitation. Turn left here. Follow the creek. Slow down, the mailbox is easy to miss. Finally, she pointed toward a modest white cottage surrounded by lavender bushes. There. The house was beautiful in the simplest possible way. A small front porch, white rocking chairs, blue shutters, flower boxes beneath every window. Someone clearly loved living there. Near the porch, an elderly man was watering roses. He looked to be in his 70s.
Tall.
Gentle-faced. When he noticed Emily's truck, he smiled warmly. Then his expression became curious as he saw the rest of us. He slowly set the watering can aside. Emily climbed out first. He walked toward her. You came early today. I did. I brought friends. He looked at us kindly. I'm Peter. Emily introduced everyone. When she finally reached me, she paused. And this, she smiled, is William Hayes's daughter. Peter's smile disappeared. Not from fear, from recognition. He quietly removed his gardening gloves. I've heard that name. I looked at him. You have? For many years. He nodded toward the cottage. Margaret speaks about William more often than she speaks about herself. My throat tightened. So she remembers him. Peter smiled gently. Every day. He looked toward the house. Some mornings she forgets what she had for breakfast, but she has never forgotten William Hayes. Those words struck me harder than I expected. Even at 100 years old, my father remained part of her daily thoughts. Peter opened the gate. Come inside. Then he hesitated. I should warn you. What is it? Some days Margaret remembers yesterday. Some days she remembers 70 years ago. And occasionally, he smiled softly. She remembers both at the same time. The cottage smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. Sunlight poured through lace curtains. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. There were grandchildren, great-grandchildren, vacations, Christmas dinners, birthdays. A full life. Exactly the life Thomas had hoped she would someday have. Peter noticed me studying the photographs. She was happy. He said it almost as though he needed us to know. She loved Thomas. And she loved me. There was never any conflict. Only gratitude. I nodded. I understand. I think William would have understood too. Peter smiled. I've always believed that. We followed him down a short hallway. The door at the end stood slightly open. Peter stopped before entering. He turned toward me. She has been expecting someone. My heart skipped. Expecting? He nodded. For years. I frowned. What do you mean? Peter smiled almost sheepishly. Every Sunday. She asks the same question. I felt suddenly unable to breathe. What question? He looked directly into my eyes. Did William finally find the watch? Tears filled my eyes instantly. She had waited too. Not just my father. Not just Emily. Margaret had been waiting as well. waiting for the promise to reach its end. Peter gently pushed the bedroom door open. Morning light filled the quiet room. Near the window, an elderly woman sat wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Her silver hair had been carefully brushed. Her hands rested peacefully in her lap. She looked smaller than I expected, fragile, yet somehow, the room seemed to revolve around her. Peter knelt beside her chair. Margaret. She slowly turned her head. Her eyes, though clouded with age, remained remarkably gentle. You have visitors. She smiled politely. That's nice. Peter pointed toward Emily. You remember Emily. Margaret laughed softly. Of course. You still cheat at cards. Emily laughed through tears. I do. Then Peter looked at me. And this, he paused, is William's daughter. The room became perfectly still. Margaret blinked once, then twice. She looked at me carefully, longer than before. Suddenly, her eyes filled with tears. Very slowly, she whispered 4 words. He kept his promise. I couldn't speak. I simply knelt beside her chair. Carefully, I opened the satchel, removed the faded blue handkerchief, unwrapped the pocket watch, placed it gently into her waiting hands. Margaret stared at it for several seconds. Her fingers traced every scratch, every dent, every crack in the crystal. Then she pressed the watch against her heart, closed her eyes, and quietly whispered the name she had not spoken aloud in 74 years. Thomas. No one in the room moved. No one interrupted. Some reunions deserve silence. After a long while, Margaret opened her eyes again. She looked at me, then at the 2 letters resting beside the watch. One written by her husband, one written by my father. She smiled softly. I think, she whispered, it's finally time I read them. No one reached for the letters. Not immediately. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Its steady rhythm reminded me of something strange. For 74 years, the only clock that had truly mattered was the one that had stopped. Now, surrounded by people whose lives had been shaped by that single frozen moment, time was moving again. Margaret held the pocket watch carefully in both hands. She did not try to open it. She already knew what she would find. The cracked crystal, the frozen hands. 417. Instead, she gently ran her thumb across the brass case, smiling through tears. I polish this every Friday. She laughed softly. Thomas always polished it on Sundays. He said I never did it properly. Emily smiled. He was probably right. Margaret looked at her with playful annoyance. He certainly thought so. For the first time since we had entered the cottage, the room filled with quiet laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of laughter shared by people who had survived enough sorrow to treasure even the smallest smile. Peter quietly stepped closer. I'll make tea. No one objected. It felt like exactly what Thomas would have wanted. Ordinary kindness. Nothing more. Nothing less. As Peter disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret looked at me. Would you read them? I blinked. The letters. She nodded. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Then she smiled gently. But I think my heart still is. I unfolded Thomas's letter first. The paper seemed even more fragile inside Margaret's room, perhaps because it had finally reached the place where it belonged. I began reading.
Slowly, carefully.
Every sentence filled the room with memories that had waited decades to be heard. When I reached the passage about ordinary happiness, Margaret quietly laughed. He really hated fixing that kitchen window. Emily laughed too. He complained about it for months. Margaret shook her head. No. He complained because I complained. The laughter faded naturally. Then came the paragraph about the workshop, the porch, the swing for children who never arrived. Margaret closed her eyes. We tried. She whispered it so softly I almost missed it. We wanted a family very much. Emily reached over and gently squeezed her hand. Neither woman looked at the other. They didn't need to. Some griefs become so old they no longer require words. When I reached the passage about the safety deposit box, Margaret looked directly at the watch. I knew, she whispered. I always knew he left something there. You did. She nodded. Thomas believed important promises should always have witnesses. He told me where the box was, but he never gave me the key.
Why?
He smiled. She smiled too, and said, if I ever need someone else to return this, then that person deserves to keep the key until they're ready. I paused. Thomas had trusted the future. He had trusted people he hadn't even met. Somehow, he had been right. I continued reading. When I reached the final paragraph, remember me because I loved. Margaret covered her face with trembling hands. The room remained completely silent. Only after several minutes did she lower them again. I forgot those words, she whispered. I remembered everything else, but not that. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. Thank you for bringing them home. I carefully folded Thomas's letter, then picked up my father's. Margaret noticed the different handwriting immediately. She looked at the page for several seconds before speaking. I never met William. Her words surprised me. You didn't. She slowly shook her head. Not face to face. I saw him once. Across the road. Beneath the oak tree. My heart tightened. Emily quietly looked away. Margaret continued. I wanted to run to him. So badly. What stopped you? Margaret smiled sadly. I looked at his hands. I frowned. My father's hands? She nodded. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring when Thomas died. But 26 years later, he was. I suddenly understood. He had married my mother. Margaret nodded. He had children. He had a life. And I realized. She looked toward the garden outside her bedroom window. Thomas wouldn't want me to reopen old wounds. Emily whispered gently. So you stayed hidden? Margaret nodded. I cried the entire drive home, but I never regretted the decision. I looked at her carefully. Not even once? She smiled. Not once. Then she surprised me. Do you know why? I shook my head, because I saw something in William's face.
What? Peace.
I almost interrupted, but she continued. He still carried sadness. Of course he did, but he also carried love. He had built a beautiful life. I couldn't ask him to carry mine too. The room fell silent once again. I unfolded my father's letter. Margaret closed her eyes before I read the first line, as though she already knew every word waiting inside. I read slowly, deliberately. When I reached the part where my father admitted searching for her for years, Margaret quietly smiled through tears. I know, she whispered. I always knew. I stopped reading. You knew? Emily answered instead. I told her. When William visited me, I always told her. He came again. He still hadn't given up. He was healthy. He looked tired. He smiled today. He brought flowers. Every visit. Every year. Emily had carried news of my father back to Margaret, without revealing where she lived. The realization was almost overwhelming. The promise had never truly separated them. It had connected them, in the only way it safely could. When I reached the paragraph where my father confessed he had accepted public blame rather than stop searching, Margaret's shoulders began to shake. She wept openly. Not quietly anymore. Not politely. The kind of tears that belong to 74 years of gratitude. When I finally finished reading, no one spoke. Margaret slowly reached toward me. I placed the letter gently into her hands. She held it against her heart, just as she had held the watch. Then she looked directly into my eyes. There is something William never knew. My heartbeat quickened. What is it? She smiled warmly. I answered his letter. The room fell completely still. I stared at her. You wrote back. Margaret nodded. The very same week. Emily looked genuinely shocked. You never told me. Margaret smiled. I couldn't. I barely managed to whisper. What happened to it? Margaret looked toward an old wooden writing desk standing beneath the window. The answer, she said softly, has been waiting in that drawer since 1977. For a moment, no one moved. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the old writing desk beneath the window. It was an ordinary piece of furniture. Solid oak. Its varnish had faded over the years. One of its brass handles had been replaced with a wooden knob that didn't quite match. The sort of desk most people would walk past without noticing.
And yet,
According to Margaret, it had quietly guarded one final secret for almost 50 years. Peter crossed the room first. May I? Margaret smiled gently. I think William's daughter should. I stood slowly. My hands felt strangely heavy. Every step toward the desk carried the weight of everyone who had come before me. Thomas, William, Margaret, Emily, Daniel, promises, regret, hope. All of it seemed to gather around that single drawer. I wrapped my fingers around the brass handle. For an instant, I hesitated. Then I pulled. The drawer opened without resistance. Inside were neatly arranged writing supplies. A fountain pen, several blank envelopes, bundles of ribbon, a pair of reading glasses. Everything exactly where Margaret had left it. Nothing unusual. Until I noticed a false wooden panel at the back. It looked almost identical to the rest of the drawer. Almost. A tiny groove ran along one edge. I slipped my fingernail beneath it. The panel lifted easily. Beneath it rested a cream-colored envelope. Its paper had aged beautifully. Across the front, written in elegant cursive, were 6 words. For William Hayes, if possible. I closed my eyes for just a moment. My father had written to Margaret. Margaret had answered. Neither letter had ever reached the other. Not because either had stopped caring. Because life had quietly placed promises between them. I turned back toward the room. Margaret watched me with a peaceful smile. I wrote it the day after Emily told me he had come again. You wanted to send it? She nodded. Very much. Why didn't you? She looked toward the garden outside. I addressed it. I sealed it. I even bought the stamp. She laughed softly. But then I imagined him opening it. What did you imagine? I imagined him leaving everything behind. His wife. His children. His peaceful life. Not because he wanted to. Because he would feel responsible. She slowly shook her head. I loved Thomas too much to let that happen. The room fell silent. For the first time, I truly understood the impossible kindness that had existed between these people. No one had acted out of pride, or fear, or selfishness. Each had chosen to carry pain, to spare someone else from carrying more. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Margaret looked at me. Please, she whispered. Read it. I nodded, then began. Dear William, Emily tells me you still come every Sunday. She tells me you still carry Thomas's watch. She tells me you still apologize. Please, stop. Thomas forgave you before he closed his eyes. I forgave you before I knew your name. There is nothing left to forgive. I paused. Already, tears blurred the page. Margaret smiled gently. I hoped those words would reach him. They never did. I continued. You have already done more for Thomas than anyone could have asked. You searched for me. You protected his memories. You honored his promises.
Now, please honor mine.
Go home. Love your wife. Hold your children. Grow old without guilt. When you laugh, Thomas lives. When you love, Thomas lives. When you build the peaceful life he wanted for all of us, Thomas lives. That is how I choose to remember him. Not beneath broken steel. Not beside railway tracks. But inside ordinary happiness. The room had become completely still. Peter quietly removed his glasses. Emily held Samuel's hand. Even Mr. Collins, who had spent his career surrounded by old documents, looked unable to hide his emotion. I read the final page. One day, perhaps many years from now, your daughter may find this. If she does, tell her something for me. Tell her her father was one of the gentlest men this world has ever known. Tell her I never stopped praying that he found peace. And if she is reading this after we are both gone,
Tell her she owes us nothing.
The promise ended the day Thomas placed the watch in your hands. Everything after that was love, with gratitude that words cannot measure. Margaret Whittaker. I lowered the letter. No one spoke. Margaret's eyes remained closed. A single tear rested on her cheek. She smiled. I always wondered, she whispered, whether he ever became happy. I smiled through my own tears.
He did.
She slowly opened her eyes. Tell me.
So I did.
I told her about my father teaching me to ride a bicycle, about the little vegetable garden he cared for every summer, about the Christmas mornings when he insisted on cooking breakfast even though he always burned the toast, about the way he whistled while fixing broken chairs, about how he never forgot birthdays, about how he cried quietly when my first child was born, about how he still held my mother's hand every evening while watching television. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she laughed softly. I knew it. You did. He found happiness. She leaned back comfortably in her chair. Thomas would have been so relieved. The afternoon sunlight had begun filling the room with a warm golden glow. It reminded me of something my father often used to say. A good day doesn't need to be exciting. It only needs to end with gratitude. For the first time, I finally understood what he meant. Just then, Peter quietly entered carrying a small wooden box. I almost forgot. Margaret smiled knowingly. So did I. He placed the box on her lap. She gently opened it. Inside, neatly folded, was a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon that had once tied Thomas's original letter. Beside it rested a small handwritten note. Margaret handed both to me. I've been saving these, she whispered, for the person who finally finished William's promise. I accepted the little wooden box with both hands. It felt surprisingly light. Inside, the faded blue ribbon rested exactly as Margaret had described, neatly folded beside a small handwritten note. For a long moment, I simply looked at them. Not because I was afraid to touch them, because I understood something my father had understood for decades. Some objects carry more than memories. They carry people. Margaret smiled. Open the note. Her voice had grown softer during the afternoon. Not weaker. Simply peaceful. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has finally laid down a burden carried for a lifetime. I unfolded the small piece of paper. The handwriting was Thomas's. Unlike the letters we had already read, this message was astonishingly brief. Only 3 lines. Margaret, if this ribbon ever returns home, it means kindness survived longer than I did. That is enough. I read the words twice, then a third time. Each reading somehow made them more beautiful. There was no sadness in them, no fear, no regrets, only trust. Thomas had believed that goodness would outlive him. He had entrusted that belief to ordinary people, to William, to Margaret, to Emily, to Daniel, and now, without realizing it,
To me.
I looked up. Margaret was watching my face carefully. He always believed people were better than they thought they were. I smiled. My father believed the same. She nodded. That's why they became friends so quickly. For a while, no one spoke. The afternoon sun slowly drifted across the wooden floor, filling the room with warm amber light. Outside, I could hear birds singing in the garden. It struck me how ordinary everything felt. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just peaceful. Exactly as Thomas had described happiness all those years ago. Peter quietly brought in a tray with tea and slices of homemade apple cake. Margaret laughed. I hope you still like apple cake. Emily smiled. Thomas certainly did. Peter looked confused. I thought you didn't like apples. Margaret laughed even harder. I didn't. I liked watching Thomas eat them. The room filled with gentle laughter once again. Small stories followed. Emily remembered how Thomas always carried peppermints in his coat pocket. Samuel remembered Daniel teaching him to whistle with 2 fingers. Mr. Collins recalled his father's admiration for William Hayes, even though the newspapers had tried to destroy his reputation. I shared stories from my childhood. How my father repaired broken toys for neighborhood children without charging a penny. How he secretly shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways before dawn. How he never allowed anyone to eat alone at our family table. Every story revealed the same man. Not perfect, simply kind. Eventually, Margaret looked toward the pocket watch still resting beside her. She reached for it slowly, held it for several seconds, then looked at me. "I've been thinking." I waited. "I don't believe this belongs to me." The word surprised everyone. "But Thomas wanted you to have it." She smiled gently.
No.
"He wanted someone trustworthy to protect it." She closed the watch carefully. "That work is finished." She placed it into my hands. "I think it belongs where it has lived for most of its life." I immediately shook my head. "I can't." "You can." "No. It's yours." Margaret smiled patiently. "Listen to me." I fell silent. "For 43 years, William cared for this watch. For another 32, you did." She touched my hand. "It has become part of your family's story, too." I looked down at the old brass case. For the first time, it no longer felt heavy. It felt warm, almost familiar. Emily quietly nodded. "I agree." Samuel smiled. "So do I." Even Mr. Collins added softly, "History isn't about ownership. It's about stewardship." Margaret laughed. "Exactly." She leaned back comfortably. "So promise me one thing." I looked at her. "What?" "When someone asks about that old watch, don't begin with the accident." I frowned slightly. "Then where should I begin?" Her smile widened. "Begin with Thomas laughing. Begin with William searching. Begin with kindness. That is the true story." I felt tears gathering again. "I promise." She nodded once. Content. Peaceful. Satisfied. As evening approached, we prepared to leave. Emily embraced Margaret first. The two women held each other for a long time. Neither said very much. They didn't need to. Samuel thanked Peter quietly for caring for Margaret all those years. Peter smiled. I was the lucky one. When my turn came, I knelt beside Margaret's chair. She gently cupped my face with both hands. "You have your father's eyes." People had told me that all my life. Until now, I had never understood why it mattered. She kissed my forehead. "Tell him something for me." I smiled through tears. "I can't. He's gone." Margaret looked toward the evening sky beyond the window, then smiled. "I know, but tell him anyway." I nodded. "I will." As we walked toward the front door, Peter suddenly called after us. "Oh, there was one more thing." He disappeared briefly into another room. When he returned, he carried a small framed photograph. "I think this belongs with William's family." He handed it to me. It was the very first photograph ever taken of Thomas, Margaret, and William together. 3 friends, standing beneath the great oak tree, all smiling. No tragedy, no guilt, no burden. Just 3 ordinary people enjoying an ordinary Sunday afternoon. On the back of the frame, in Thomas's handwriting, were the words that would remain with me for the rest of my life. Some promises are not meant to imprison us. They're meant to lead us home. The drive home felt different. No one hurried. No one filled the silence simply because silence felt uncomfortable. Some journeys end with excitement. Others end with peace. This one ended with gratitude. The pocket watch rested beside me on the passenger seat, wrapped once again in my father's faded blue handkerchief. But it no longer felt like an unfinished promise. It felt like a completed one. As the miles passed beneath the tires, I watched the evening sun disappear behind the fields. The same countryside my father had driven through so many times. The same roads where he had carried hope instead of certainty. For 43 years, he had believed one more Sunday might change everything. He never lived to see that day.
And yet, in a way,
He had been there all along. Every letter we opened, every story we uncovered, every act of kindness that had survived him. He had quietly walked beside us from the very beginning. When I finally arrived home, the house seemed strangely familiar. Not because anything had changed, because I had. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The hallway was exactly as I had left it. The old coat rack, the family photographs, the grandfather clock, the little scratch on the wooden floor where my grandson had once dropped his toy truck. Life had continued while I was away. but I saw everything differently. I walked slowly toward the living room. For decades, the top drawer of the oak cabinet had been the watch's home. I opened it. Inside lay the empty blue handkerchief, the place where the watch had rested for 32 years. I looked down, then quietly closed the drawer.
No.
Not anymore. Instead, I walked toward the bookshelf. There, beside my father's favorite history books, stood a small glass display cabinet. Inside were a few treasured family keepsakes. My mother's wedding brooch, a tiny wooden horse my grandfather had carved, my daughter's first ballet shoes. I carefully placed the pocket watch beside them, not as a relic, not as evidence, as family. Then I placed Thomas's letter behind it, Margaret's letter, my father's letter, the faded blue ribbon, the photograph beneath the oak tree. Everything together, not hidden, not locked away, visible, because stories that survive deserve to be seen. The following Sunday, I visited my father's grave. It was early morning. The cemetery was almost empty. The grass still glistened with dew. I carried no flowers. Instead, I carried the framed photograph Peter had given me. I sat quietly beside the headstone for a long time before speaking. I found her. The words felt surprisingly natural, as though he had been waiting to hear them. I found Margaret. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I delivered your letter. And Thomas's. I smiled. She read every word. For several moments, I simply looked at his name carved into the stone. William Hayes, beloved husband, loving father. No mention of promises. No mention of sacrifice. No mention of the burden he had carried.
Perhaps there didn't need to be.
I took a slow breath. She forgave you. My voice trembled. Actually, I laughed softly through tears. She says there was never anything to forgive. The breeze grew a little stronger. Leaves rustled overhead. I remembered Margaret's final request.
Tell him anyway.
So I did. You became happy. You raised a family. You loved Mom exactly the way Thomas hoped you would. You kept your promise. And I gently touched the top of the headstone. You can finally come home. For the first time since his funeral 32 years earlier. I didn't cry. I smiled, because grief had quietly made room for gratitude. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Word began to spread, not through newspapers, not through television, but through ordinary conversations. Mr. Collins contacted the Easton Historical Society. The railway archives were reopened. The forgotten maintenance records were reviewed. Engineers examined the old reports. Historians compared witness statements that had never been published. One fact became impossible to ignore. The coupling had indeed been defective long before the accident. William Hayes had not caused the disaster. He had tried to prevent it. Nearly a year later, the county organized a small public ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Just neighbors, railway workers, local families, and a few historians. A new bronze plaque was unveiled outside the old station. Its inscription read, "In memory of the 4 workers who lost their lives on October 17, 1951. Beneath those names, for the first time, appeared another, William Hayes, who risked his own life trying to save others." Samuel stood beside me during the ceremony. Emily attended despite her age. Peter carefully pushed Margaret's wheelchair beneath the shade of a maple tree. When the cloth covering the plaque was finally removed, Margaret quietly whispered, "There you are, William." No applause followed. No speeches felt necessary. The silence itself became the tribute. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I returned alone to the old oak tree, the same one where Thomas had carved his initials, the same one where my father had waited every Sunday, the same one where Emily had hidden the diary. The tree looked exactly as it always had.
Strong.
Patient. Unhurried. I sat beneath its branches as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the fields. Then, without thinking, I reached into my pocket. There was a peppermint. I smiled. Samuel had told me Thomas always carried peppermints. I unwrapped it, placed it gently at the base of the tree, not as an offering, as a thank you. A thank you to a man I had never met, who somehow changed my father's life. And, decades later,
Mine.
as I stood to leave, I noticed something carved into the opposite side of the trunk, hidden beneath fresh moss, so faint that it was almost invisible. I brushed it gently with my hand. The words slowly appeared. They were carved in my father's handwriting, probably many years after Thomas died. Just one sentence. I found peace here. I rested my hand against the bark, closed my eyes, and whispered, "So did I." Nearly a year passed. Life settled into its familiar rhythm again. The extraordinary slowly became ordinary. I watered my flowers each morning. My grandchildren still visited on Saturdays. The neighborhood children still rode their bicycles past my house every afternoon. From the outside, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. The glass cabinet in my living room had become the first place visitors noticed. Not because it was expensive, not because it contained anything valuable, but because there was something strangely peaceful about it. The old pocket watch rested on a small velvet stand. Behind it stood 3 letters, one written by Thomas, one by my father, one by Margaret. Beside them sat the faded blue ribbon and the photograph beneath the oak tree. People often stopped in front of the cabinet. "What is that watch?" they would ask. For years, I would have answered differently. I would have said, "It belonged to my father."
Now.
I smiled. "It belonged to a promise." That answer usually earned a puzzled look. Then we would sit down. I'd make tea, and I would begin telling the story. Never with the accident. Never with guilt. Exactly as Margaret had asked. I always began with Thomas laughing. I spoke about an ordinary man who loved clocks more than repairing his own kitchen window. A man who dreamed of building a porch and a swing for children who never came. Then I spoke about William Hayes, a quiet railway worker who believed promises mattered even when no one was watching. Finally, I spoke about Margaret, a woman who chose forgiveness instead of bitterness. About Emily, who carried silence not because it was easy, but because she believed it protected someone she loved. And about Daniel, who spent his life wishing he had spoken sooner. Every time I finished, people became quiet, not because the story was sad, because it reminded them of someone, a father, a grandmother, an old friend, a promise they had forgotten. History, I discovered, has a curious way of becoming personal. One afternoon, several months after the ceremony in Easton, there was another knock at my front door. 3 slow knocks, just like the day Samuel had first arrived. For a brief moment, my heart skipped. I opened the door. Standing there was a young woman in her early 30s. She held the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been older than 6. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes." "My name is Rebecca." She smiled nervously. "I'm Thomas Whitaker's great-granddaughter." For a moment, I simply stared. Then I smiled. "You'd better come inside." The little boy immediately noticed the glass cabinet. He walked toward it without hesitation. Children have a remarkable instinct for finding the center of a room. He pointed at the watch. "Is that his?" Rebecca laughed softly. "It is." Then she looked at me. "My grandmother," she said, "was Margaret's niece." I remembered the employee ledger. Emily Whitaker, Thomas's niece. Time had quietly completed another circle. Rebecca removed a small envelope from her handbag. "My grandmother wanted you to have this." "Emily." She nodded. "I visited her last week. She's becoming very tired. She asked me to bring this personally." My hands trembled as I accepted it. Emily's handwriting covered the front. "For Eleanor." I sat down before opening it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, exactly as Emily always had. The letter was short, very much like Thomas's final note. "Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, it probably means I'm finally learning what comes after a long life. Please don't be sad. I've spent enough years being grateful to make peace with leaving. I wanted to thank you, not for returning the watch, not for finding Margaret, not even for clearing William's name. I wanted to thank you because you finished something none of us could finish alone. You reminded me that promises should never become prisons. Their purpose is to carry love safely until someone else can continue the journey. Now the journey is yours to tell. With affection, Emily. I folded the letter carefully. Rebecca smiled. She said you'd understand. I do. I really did. Before leaving, the little boy stood once more in front of the cabinet.
He looked up at me.
Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't anyone fix the watch? I smiled. Adults had asked me that question many times. But somehow, hearing it from a child made the answer feel even more important. I knelt beside him, because it already tells the perfect time. He frowned. But it doesn't move.
No.
It doesn't. So, how can it tell the time? I gently rested my hand on the glass. It reminds us of the exact moment one person chose kindness over fear. The little boy thought about that for a while. Then he nodded. I think, he said seriously, that's a very important time. It is. He smiled. Then maybe it shouldn't be fixed. I laughed. I think you're right. As Rebecca drove away, I stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the street. The afternoon sun reflected softly against the cabinet window inside my living room. The watch caught the light for just a second. For years, I believed it had stopped. Now I knew the truth. The watch had never measured time. It had measured love. And love had never stopped moving. 5 years later, I was no longer the only person telling the story. That surprised me more than anything else. Stories have a curious way of choosing their own paths. Once they are finally told, they no longer belong to the person who discovered them. They belong to everyone who needs them. It began quietly. The Easton Historical Society created a small permanent exhibit about the railway accident. Nothing elaborate. Just one room. A few photographs. Copies of the letters. The maintenance records that had cleared my father's name. And a single framed sentence displayed beside them. Some promises are not meant to imprison us. They are meant to lead us home. Whenever I visited, I always noticed the same thing. People entered speaking softly, but they never left talking about the accident. They left talking about kindness, about forgiveness, about the people they wished they had thanked while there was still time. That, I think, would have pleased Thomas the most. Emily passed away peacefully the following spring. She was 97 years old. Margaret followed her just 9 months later. She was 101. Peter sent me a handwritten note after the funeral. Only one sentence. She was smiling when she left. I cried when I read it, not because Margaret was gone, because I knew exactly why she had smiled. The promise had finally reached its destination. There was nothing left unfinished. One autumn afternoon, my oldest granddaughter came to visit. She had just turned 16, the same age I had been when my father first placed the pocket watch into my hands. She stood quietly in front of the glass cabinet. You always look at it. I smiled. So do you. She laughed. I guess I do. After a moment she asked, Grandma, when you're gone, what should happen to the watch? For a long time, I didn't answer. Instead, I unlocked the cabinet, carefully lifted the watch into my hands. It felt exactly as it always had.
Warm.
Comfortable. Familiar. I placed it gently into hers. She looked surprised. It's heavier than I expected. I smiled. It used to be. She looked at me, confused. What do you mean? It carried guilt. It carried grief. It carried 74 years of waiting. I gently closed her fingers around it. But not anymore. What does it carry now? I looked toward the window, where the late afternoon sunlight filled the room with the same golden glow that had shone beneath the old oak tree. It carries a story. She nodded thoughtfully. I think stories weigh less. They do. Much less. That evening, after she had gone home, I found myself thinking about my father again. Not the young man from the newspaper photograph. Not the weary man who spent 43 years searching, but the father who taught me to tie my shoes, who whistled while fixing broken chairs, who always let me scrape the last bit of cake batter from the mixing bowl. It occurred to me that for most of my life, I had admired him because he was a good father. Only after he was gone did I discover he had also been an extraordinary man. The strange thing was, he never seemed to notice the difference. He never thought of himself as extraordinary. He simply believed that if someone trusted you, you should do your best not to disappoint them. Perhaps that is all greatness really is. A few months later, I returned to Easton one final time. Not because anything remained unfinished, because I wanted to say goodbye. I visited the railway memorial, the museum, the archive. Then, just before sunset, I drove to the old farmhouse. The house had finally been demolished. Only the great oak tree remained. It stood exactly as it always had. Patient,
Steady.
watching generations come and go. I walked beneath its branches. The carvings had faded even more. Nature was slowly reclaiming them. One day, no one would be able to read the initials anymore. And somehow, that no longer saddened me. Wood fades. Stone crumbles. Paper yellows. But love has a remarkable way of finding new places to live. I sat beneath the tree until the first evening stars appeared. Before leaving, I reached into my pocket. Not for a peppermint this time. For a small envelope. Inside was a copy of every letter. Thomas's, William's, Margaret's, Emily's. I buried the envelope beneath the roots of the oak, not to hide them, but to return them home. Then I whispered quietly, "Thank you." I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. Thomas, my father, Margaret, Emily, perhaps all of them, perhaps none. The wind answered by moving gently through the branches. For just a moment, it almost sounded like distant laughter. People sometimes ask me what became of the pocket watch. The answer disappoints them. It wasn't sold. It wasn't donated to a museum. It wasn't locked inside a bank vault. It remained exactly where my father would have wanted it. Inside our family. Not because it was valuable. Because every generation deserves to remember that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary kindness. The watch still rests with its hands frozen at 4:17. It has never ticked again. It never needed to, because its purpose was never to count the hours. Its purpose was to remind us that a single moment of compassion can echo through generations. One promise kept by an ordinary railway worker. One act of forgiveness by a grieving widow. One secret protected by a faithful niece. One daughter who refused to let the story disappear. Together, they proved something I now believe with all my heart. Time eventually stops for every one of us. But kindness, if someone chooses to carry it forward, never does. And whenever my grandchildren ask me about the old watch, I never begin with the accident. I begin exactly where Margaret asked me to, with a young man named Thomas, laughing beneath a great oak tree, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, completely unaware that the greatest legacy he would ever leave behind
Would not be a watch.
it would be the goodness he planted in the hearts of others. And, perhaps, that is the only kind of time that truly lasts forever. The end.